Community and diversity. One of the most characteristic features of our country is its astounding variety. The American people include the descendants of native Indians, colonial Europeans of British, French, and Spanish background, Africans, and migrants from virtually every country and continent. Indeed, at the beginning of the new century, the United States is absorbing a flood of immigrants from Latin America and Asia that rivals the great tide of people from Eastern and Southern Europe 100 years before. What's more, our country is one of the world's most spacious, sprawling across than 3.6 million square miles of territory. The struggle to meld a single nation out of our many far-flung communities is what much of American history is all about. That is the story told in this book. Every human society is made up of communities. A community is a set of relationships linking men, women, and their families to a coherent social whole that is more than the sum of its parts. In a community, people develop the capacity for unified action. In a community, people learn, often through trial and error, how to transform and adapt to their environment. The sentiment that binds the members of a community together is the mother of group consciousness and ethnic identity. In the making of history, communities are far more important than even the greatest of leaders, for the community is the institution most capable of passing a distinctive historical tradition to future generations. Communities bind people together in multiple ways. They can be as small as local neighborhoods, in which people maintain face-to-face relations, or as large as the nation itself. This book examines American history from the perspective of community life, an ever-widening frame that has included larger and larger groups of Americans. Networks of kinship and friendship, and connections across generations and among families, establish the bonds essential to community life. Shared feelings about values and history establish the basis for common identity. In communities, people find the power to act collectively in their own interest. But American communities frequently took shape as a result of serious conflicts among groups, and within communities there was often significant fighting among competing groups or classes. Thus the term community, as we use it here, includes conflict and discord as well as harmony and agreement. For decades Americans have complained about the loss of community. But community has not disappeared, it has been continuously reinvented. Until the late 18th century, community was defined primarily by space and local geography. But in the 19th century, communities were reshaped by new and powerful historical forces such as the marketplace, industrialization, the corporation, mass immigration, mass media, and the growth of the nation-state. In the 20th century, Americans struggled to balance commitments to multiple communities. These were defined not simply by local spatial arrangements, but by categories as varied as race and ethnicity, occupation, political affiliation, and consumer preference. The American Communities vignettes that open each chapter reflect these transformations. Most of the vignettes in the pre-Civil War chapters focus on geographically defined communities, such as the ancient Indian city at Cahokia, or the experiment in industrial urban planning in early 19th century Lowell, Massachusetts. Post-Civil War chapters explore different and more modern kinds of communities. In the 1920s, movies and radio offered communities of identification with dreams of freedom, material success, upward mobility, youth and beauty. In the 1950s, rock and roll music helped germinate a new national community of teenagers, with profound effects on the culture of the entire country in the second half of the 20th century. In the late 1970s, fear of nuclear accidents like the one at 3 Mile Island brought concerned citizens together in communities around the country and encouraged a national movement opposing nuclear power. The title for our book was suggested by the Latin phrase selected by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson for the Great Seal of the United States, E pluribus unum, out of many comes unity. These men understood that unity could not be imposed by a powerful central authority but had to develop out of mutual respect among Americans of different backgrounds. The revolutionary leadership expressed the hope that such respect could grow on the basis of a remarkable proposition: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The national government of the United States would preserve local and state authority but would guarantee individual rights. The nation would be strengthened by guarantees of difference. Out of many comes strength. That is the promise of America and the premise of this book. The underlying dialectic of American history, we believe, is that as a people we must locate our national unity in the celebration of the differences that exist among us. These differences can be our strength, as long as we affirm the promise of the Declaration. Protecting the right to be different, in other words, is absolutely fundamental to the continued existence of democracy, and that right is best protected by the existence of strong and vital communities. We are bound together as a nation by the ideal of local and cultural differences protected by our common commitment to the values of the American Revolution. Today those values are endangered by those who use the tactics of mass terror. In the wake of the September 11, 2001 attack on the United States, and with the continuing threat of biological, chemical, or even nuclear assaults, Americans cannot afford to lose faith in our historic vision. The thousands of victims buried in the smoking ruins of the World Trade Center included people from dozens of different ethnic and national groups. The United States is a multicultural and transnational society. We must rededicate ourselves to the protection and defense of the promise of diversity and unity. Our history demonstrates that the promise has always been problematic. Centrifugal forces have been powerful in the American past, and at times the country seemed about to fracture into its component parts. Our transformation from a collection of groups and regions into a nation was marked by painful and often violent struggles. Our past is filled with conflicts between Indians and colonists, masters and slaves, patriots and loyalists, Northerners and Southerners, Easterners and Westerners, capitalists and workers, and sometimes the government and the people. War can bring out our best, but it can also bring out our worst. During World War II, thousands of Japanese American citizens were deprived of their rights and locked up in isolated detention centers because of their ethnic background. Americans often appear to be little more than a contentious collection of peoples with conflicting interests, divided by region and background, race and class. Our most influential leaders have also sometimes suffered a crisis of faith in the American project of liberty and justice for all. Thomas Jefferson not only believed in the inferiority of African Americans but feared that immigrants from outside the Anglo-American tradition might warp and bias the development of the nation and render it a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass. We have not always lived up to the American promise, and there is a dark side to our history. It took the bloodiest war in American history to secure the human rights of African Americans, and the struggle for full equality for all our citizens has yet to be won. During the great influx of immigrants in the early 20th century, fears much like Jefferson's led to movements to Americanize the foreign-born by forcing them, in the words of one leader, to give up the languages, customs, and methods of life which they have brought with them across the ocean, and adopt instead the language, habits, and customs of this country, and the general standards and ways of American living. Similar thinking motivated Congress at various times to bar the immigration of Africans, Asians, and other people of color into the country, and to force assimilation on American Indians by denying them the freedom to practice their religion or even to speak their own language. Such calls for restrictive unity resound in our own day. But other Americans have argued for a more fulsome version of Americanization. What is the American, this new man? Asked the French immigrant Michel Crèvecoeur in 1782. A strange mixture of blood which you will find in no other country. In America, he wrote, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men. A century later, Crèvecoeur was echoed by historian Frederick Jackson Turner, who believed that, in the crucible of the frontier, the immigrants were Americanized, liberated, and fused into a mixed race, English in neither nationality nor characteristics. The process has gone on from the early days to our own. The process by which diverse communities have come to share a set of common American values is one of the most fundamental aspects of our history. It did not occur, however, because of compulsory Americanization programs, but because of free public education, popular participation in democratic politics, and the impact of popular culture. Contemporary America does have a common culture. We share a commitment to freedom of thought and expression, we join in the aspirations to own our own homes and send our children to college, we laugh at the same television programs or video clips on YouTube. To a degree that too few Americans appreciate, this common culture resulted from a complicated process of mutual discovery that took place when different ethnic and regional groups encountered one another. Consider just one small and unique aspect of our culture, the barbecue. Americans have been barbecuing since before the beginning of written history. Early settlers adopted this technique of cooking from the Indians. The word itself comes from a native term for a framework of sticks over a fire on which meat was slowly cooked. Colonists typically barbecued pork, fed on Indian corn. African slaves lent their own touch by introducing the use of spicy sauces. The ritual that is a part of nearly every American family's 4th of July silently celebrates the heritage of diversity that went into making our common culture. The American educator John Dewey recognized this diversity early in the last century. The genuine American, the typical American, is himself a hyphenated character, he declared, international and interracial in his makeup. It was up to all Americans, Dewey argued, to see to it that the hyphen connects instead of separates. We, the authors of Out of Many, endorse Dewey's perspective. Creation comes from the impact of diversity, the American philosopher Horace Collin wrote about the same time. We also endorse Collin's vision of the American promise, a democracy of nationalities, cooperating voluntarily and autonomously through common institutions. A multiplicity in a unity, an orchestration of mankind. And now, let the music begin. Chapter: A Continent of Villages to 1,500. Cahokia, 13th Century Life on the Mississippi. As the sun rose over the rich floodplain, the people of the riverbank city set about their daily tasks. Some went to shops where they manufactured tools, crafted pottery, worked metal, or fashioned ornamental jewelry, goods destined to be exchanged in the far corners of the continent. Others left their densely populated neighborhoods for the outlying countryside, where they worked the seemingly endless fields that fed the city. From almost any point people could see the great temple that rose from the city center. The Indian residents of this 13th century city lived and worked on the east banks of the Mississippi River, across from present-day St. Louis, a place known today as Cahokia. In the 13th century, Cahokia was an urban cluster of 20,000 or 30,000 people. Its farm fields were abundant with corn, beans, and squash. The temple, a huge earthwork pyramid, covered 15 acres at its base and rose as high as a 10-story building. The vast urban complex of Cahokia, which at its height stretched 6 miles along the Mississippi River, flourished from the 10th to the 14th century. Its residents were not nomadic hunters but farmers, participants in a complex agricultural culture that archaeologists term Mississippian. Hundreds of acres of crops fed the people of Cahokia, the largest urban community north of the Aztec civilization of central Mexico. Cahokia stood at the center of a long-distance trading system that linked it to other Indian communities over a vast area. Copper came from Lake Superior, mica from the southern Appalachians, and conch shells from the Atlantic coast. Cahokia's specialized artisans were renowned for the manufacture of high-quality flint hoes, which were exported throughout the Mississippi Valley. Evidence suggests that Cahokia was a city-state supported by tribute and taxation. Like the awe-inspiring public works of other early urban societies in other parts of the world, most notably the pyramids of ancient Egypt and the Acropolis of Athens, the Great Temple Mound of Cahokia was intended to showcase the city's wealth and power. The mounds and other colossal public works at Cahokia were the monuments of a society ruled by a class of elite leaders. From their residences atop the mound, priests and chiefs looked down on their subjects both literally and figuratively. The long history of North America before European colonization reveals that the native inhabitants developed a great variety of societies. Beginning as migrant hunting and gathering bands, they found ways to fine-tune their subsistence strategies to fit environmental possibilities and limitations. Communities in the highlands of Mexico invented systems of farming that spread to all the regions where cultivation was possible. Not only the Aztecs of Mexico and the Mayans of Central America but also communities in the Southwest and the Mississippi Valley constructed densely settled urban civilizations. North America before colonization was, as historian Howard R. Lamar phrases it, a continent of villages, a land spread with thousands of communities. 1.1 The first American settlers. What events led to the migration of Asian peoples into North America? "Why do you call us Indians?" a Massachusetts native complained to Puritan missionary John Eliot in 1646. Christopher Columbus, who mistook the Taino people of the Caribbean for the people of the East Indies, called them Indios. Within a short time this Spanish word had passed into English as Indians, and was commonly used to refer to all the native peoples of the Americas. Today anthropologists sometimes employ the term Amerindians, and others use Native Americans. But in the United States most of the descendants of the original inhabitants refer to themselves as Indian people. 1.1.1 Who are the Indian people? At the time of their first contacts, With Europeans at the beginning of the 16th century, the inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere represented more than 2,000 separate cultures, spoke several hundred different languages, and made their livings in scores of different environments. Just as the term European includes many nations, so the term Indian covers an enormous diversity among the peoples of the Americas. No single physical type characterized all the peoples of the Americas. Although most had straight, black hair and dark, almond-shaped eyes, their skin color ranged from mahogany to light brown. Few fit the red skin descriptions used by North American colonists of the 18th and 19th centuries. Indeed, it was only when Europeans had compared Indian peoples with natives of other continents, such as Africans, that they seemed similar enough to be classified as a group. Once Europeans realized that the Americas were in fact a new world, rather than part of the Asian continent, a debate began over how people might have moved there from Europe and Asia, where God had created the first man and woman. In 1590, the Spanish Jesuit missionary Joseph de Acosta reasoned that because Old World animals were present in the Americas, they must have crossed by a land bridge that could have been used by humans as well. 1.1.2 Migration from Asia. Acosta was the first to propose the Asian migration hypothesis that is widely accepted today. Siberian and American Indian populations suggest that migrants to North America began leaving Asia approximately 30,000 years ago. The migration was possible because during the last ice age, from 70,000 to 10,000 years ago, huge glaciers locked up massive volumes of water, and sea levels were as much as 300 feet lower than they are today. Asia and North America, now separated by the Bering Strait, were joined by a huge subcontinent of ice-free, treeless grassland, which geologists have named Beringia. Summers there were warm, and winters were cold but almost snow-free, so there was no glaciation. It was a perfect environment for large mammals, mammoth and mastodon, bison, horse, reindeer, camel, and saiga. Small bands of Siberian hunter-gatherers were surely attracted by these animal populations. Access to lands to the south, however, was blocked by huge ice sheets covering much of what is today Canada. How did the migrants get through those 2,000 miles of deep ice? The standard hypothesis is that with the warming of the climate and the end of the Ice Age, about 13,000 BCE, glacial melting created an ice-free corridor, an original, Pan-American highway, along the eastern front range of the Rocky Mountains. Using this thoroughfare, the hunters of big game reached the Great Plains as early as 11,000 BCE. Recently, however, new archaeological finds along the Pacific coast of North and South America have complicated this hypothesis. Radiocarbon analysis of remains discovered at several newly excavated human sites suggested dates of 12,000 BCE or earlier. The most spectacular find, at Monte Verde in southern Chile, produced striking evidence of tool-making, house building, and rock painting conservatively dated at 12,500 BCE. A number of archaeologists believe that the people who founded these settlements moved south in boats along a coastal route, an ancient, Pacific Coast Highway. There were two later migrations into North America. About 5000 BCE, the Athapascan people moved across Beringia and began to settle the forests in the northwestern area of the continent. Eventually, groups of Athapascan speakers, the ancestors of the Navajos and Apaches, migrated across the Great Plains to the southwest. A third and final migration began about 3000 BCE, long after Beringia had disappeared under rising seas, when a maritime hunting people crossed the Bering Strait in small boats. The Inuits colonized the polar coasts of the Arctic, the Yupiks the coast of southwestern Alaska, and the Aleuts the Aleutian Islands. While scientists debate the timing and mapping of these various migrations, many Indian people hold to oral traditions that say they have always lived in North America. Every culture has its origin stories, offering explanations of the customs and beliefs of the group. A number of scholars believe these origin stories may shed light on ancient history. The Haida people of the Northwest Pacific coast tell of a time long ago when the offshore islands were much larger, but then the oceans rose, they say, and flood tide woman forced them to move to higher ground. Could these stories preserve a memory of the changes at the end of the Ice Age? 1.1.3 The Clovis culture, the first environmental adaptation. The tools found at the earliest North American archaeological sites, crude stone or bone choppers and scrapers, are similar to artifacts from the same period found in Europe or Asia. About 11,000 years ago, however, ancient Americans developed a much more sophisticated style of making fluted blades and lance points, a tradition named Clovis, after the location of the initial discovery near Clovis, New Mexico, in 1926. In the years since, archaeologists have unearthed Clovis stone tools at sites throughout the continent, all dating within 1,000 or 2,000 years of one another, suggesting that the Clovis technology spread quickly throughout the continent. The evidence suggests that Clovis bands were mobile communities of foragers numbering perhaps 30 to 50 individuals from several interrelated families. They returned to the same hunting camps year after year, migrating seasonally within territories of several hundred square miles. Camps found throughout the continent overlooked watering places that would attract game. Clovis blades have been found amid the remains of mammoth, camel, horse, giant armadillo, and sloth. The global warming trend that ended the Ice Age dramatically altered the North American climate. About 15,000 years ago, the giant continental glaciers began to melt and the northern latitudes were colonized by plants, animals, and humans. Meltwater created the lake and river systems of today and raised the level of the surrounding seas, flooding not only Beringia but also vast stretches of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, creating fertile tidal pools and offshore fishing banks. 1.1.4 New ways of living on the land. These huge transformations produced new patterns of wind, rainfall, and temperature, reshaping the ecology of the entire continent and gradually producing the distinct North American regions of today. The great integrating force of a single continental climate faded, and with its passing the continental Clovis culture fragmented into a number of different regional patterns. The retreat of the glaciers led to new ways of finding food, hunting in the Arctic, foraging in the arid deserts, fishing along the coasts, hunting and gathering in the forests. These developments took place roughly 10,000 to 2,500 years ago, during what archaeologists call the Archaic period. Hunting traditions. One of the most important effects of this massive climatic shift was the stress it placed on the big game animals best suited to an Ice Age environment. The archaeological record documents the extinction of 32 classes of large New World mammals. Changing climatic conditions lowered the reproduction and survival rates of these large mammals, forcing hunting bands to intensify their hunting. As the other large mammal populations declined, hunters on the Great Plains concentrated on the herds of American bison. To hunt these animals, people needed a weapon. In archaeological sites dating from about 10,000 years ago, a new style of tool is found mingled with animal remains. This technology, named a folsum, was a refinement of the Clovis culture that featured more delicate but deadlier spear points. Hunters probably hurled the lances to which these points were attached with wooden spear throwers, attaining far greater momentum than possible using their arms alone. These archaeological finds suggest the growing complexity of early Indian communities. Hunters frequently stampeded herds of bison into canyon traps or over cliffs. At one such kill site in southeastern Colorado, dated at about 6,500 BCE, archaeologists uncovered the remains of nearly 200 bison that had been slaughtered and then systematically butchered on a single occasion. Such tasks required a sophisticated division of labor among dozens of men and women and the cooperation of a number of communities. Taking food in such great quantities also suggests a knowledge of basic preservation techniques. Desert culture in the Great Basin. The warming trend created a desert where once there had been enormous inland seas. Here Indian people developed what anthropologists call desert culture, a way of life based on the pursuit of small game and the intensified foraging of plant foods. Small communities of desert foragers migrated seasonally within a small range. Archaeologists today find the artifacts of desert foragers in the caves and rock shelters in which they lived. In addition to stone tools, there are objects of wood, hide, and fiber, wonderfully preserved for thousands of years in the dry climate. The innovative practices of desert culture gradually spread from the Great Basin to the Great Plains and the Southwest, where foraging for plant foods began to supplement hunting. About 6,000 years ago, these techniques were carried to California, where, in the natural abundance of the valleys and coasts, communities developed economies capable of supporting some of the densest populations and the first permanently settled villages in North America. Another dynamic center developed along the coast of the Pacific Northwest, where Indian communities developed a way of life based on the abundance of fish and sea mammals. Densely populated and permanently settled communities developed there as well. Forest efficiency. There were similar trends east of the Mississippi. In the centuries prior to colonization and settlement by Europeans, the whole of eastern North America was a vast forest. Communities of native people achieved a comfortable and secure life by developing a sophisticated knowledge of the rich and diverse available resources, a principle anthropologists term forest efficiency. Archaeological sites in the East suggest that during the late Archaic period community populations grew and settlements became increasingly permanent, providing convincing evidence of the practicality of forest efficiency. The different roles of men and women were reflected in the artifacts these peoples buried with their dead: axes, fishhooks, and animal bones with males, nut-cracking stones, beads, and pestles with females. 1.2 The development of farming. What were the consequences of the development of farming for native communities? At the end of the Stone Age, communities in different regions of the world independently created systems of farming, each based on a unique staple crop: rice in Southeast Asia, wheat in the Middle East, potatoes in the Andean highlands of South America, and maize in Mexico. The dynamic center of this development in North America was in the highlands of Mexico, from which the new technology spread north and east. 1.2.1 Origins in Mexico. Archaeological evidence suggests that plant cultivation in the highlands of central Mexico began about 5,000 years ago. Ancient Mexicans developed crops that responded well to human care and produced larger quantities of food in a limited space than did plants growing in the wild. Maize was particularly productive. As farming became increasingly important, it radically reshaped social life. Farming provided not only the incentive for larger families but also the means to feed them. People became less mobile, built more substantial residences near their crops, and developed more effective means of storage. Villages grew into towns and eventually into large, densely settled communities like Cahokia. Autumn harvests had to be stored during winter months, and the storage and distribution of food had to be managed. The division of labor increased with the appearance of specialists like toolmakers, craft workers, administrators, priests, and rulers. By 1000 BCE, urban communities governed by permanent bureaucracies had begun to form in Mesoamerica, the region stretching from central Mexico to Central America. By the beginning of the first millennium CE, highly productive farming was supporting complex urban civilizations in the Valley of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, and other parts of Mesoamerica. Like many of the ancient civilizations of Asia and the Mediterranean, these Mesoamerican civilizations were characterized by the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of an elite class of priests and rulers, the construction of impressive temples and other public structures, and the development of systems of mathematics and astronomy and several forms of hieroglyphic writing. These civilizations also engaged in warfare between states and practiced ritual human sacrifice. The great city of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, which emerged about 100 BCE, had a population of as many as 200,000 at the height of its power around 500 CE. Teotihuacan's leaders controlled an elaborate state-sponsored trading system that stretched from present-day Arizona to Central America and may have included coastal shipping connections with the civilizations of Peru. Teotihuacan began to decline in the 6th century, and by the 8th century it was mostly abandoned. A new empire, that of the Toltecs, dominated central Mexico from the 10th to the 12th centuries. By the 14th century, a people known as the Aztecs, migrants from the north, had settled in the Valley of Mexico and begun a dramatic expansion into a formidable imperial power. By the early 15th century, an estimated 200,000 people lived in the Aztec capital, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The Mayan peoples of the Yucatan Peninsula developed a group of competing city-states that flourished from about 300 BCE until 900 CE. Their achievements included advanced writing and calendar systems and a sophisticated knowledge of mathematics. 1.2.2 Increasing social complexity. In a few areas, farming truly did result in a revolutionary change in Indian communities, producing urban civilizations like those in Mesoamerica or on the banks of the Mississippi at Cahokia. It is likely that among the first social transformations was the development of significantly more elaborate systems of kinship. Greater population density prompted families to group themselves into clans, and separate clans gradually became responsible for different social, political, or ritual functions. Clans may have been an important mechanism for binding together the people of several communities into larger social units based on ethnic, linguistic, and territorial unity. These tribes were headed by leaders or chiefs from honored clans, often advised by councils of elders. Chiefs' primary functions were the supervision of the economy, the collection and storage of the harvest, and the distribution of food to the clans. Inequalities were kept in check by redistribution according to principles of sharing similar to those operating in foraging communities. Nowhere in North America did Indian cultures develop a concept of the private ownership of land or other resources, which were usually considered the common resource of the people and were worked collectively. Indian communities practiced a rather strict division of labor according to gender. In foraging communities, hunting was generally men's work, while the gathering of food and the maintenance of home-based camps were the responsibility of women. The development of farming may have challenged that pattern. Where hunting remained an important activity, women took responsibility for the growing of crops. But in areas like Mexico, where communities were almost totally dependent on cultivated crops for their survival, both men and women worked the fields. In most North American Indian farming communities, women and men belonged to separate social groupings, each with its own rituals and lore. Membership in these gender societies was one of the most important elements of a person's identity. Marriage ties, on the other hand, were relatively weak, and in most Indian communities divorce was a simple matter. Farming communities were far more complex than foraging communities, but they were also less stable. Growing populations demanded increasingly large surpluses of food, and this need often led to social conflict and warfare. Moreover, farming systems were especially vulnerable to changes in climate, such as drought, as well as to crises of their own making, such as soil depletion or erosion. 1.2.3 The resisted revolution. Some scholars describe the transition to farming as a revolution. Their argument is that farming offered such obvious advantages that communities rushed to adopt it. But there is very little evidence to support the notion that farming was a clearly superior way of life. Anthropologists have demonstrated that farmers work considerably longer and harder than do foragers. Moreover, farmers depend on a relatively narrow selection of plants and animals for food and are vulnerable to famine. Moreover, ignorance of cultivation was never the reason communities failed to take up farming. All foraging cultures understand a great deal about plant reproduction. Paiutes of the Great Basin systematically irrigated stands of their favorite wild food sources. Cultures in different regions assessed the relative advantages and disadvantages of adopting farming. In California and the Pacific Northwest, acorn gathering or salmon fishing made the cultivation of food crops seem a waste of time. In the Great Basin, there were attempts to farm but without much success. Before the invention of modern irrigation systems, which require sophisticated engineering, only the archaic desert culture could prevail in this harsh environment. In the neighboring Southwest, however, farming resolved certain ecological dilemmas and transformed the way of life. Like the development of more sophisticated traditions of tool manufacture, farming represented another stage in economic intensification, like the advance in tool-making represented by Clovis. Technology that kept populations and available resources in balance. It seems that where the climate favored it, people tended to adopt farming as a way of increasing the production of food, thus continuing the archaic tradition of squeezing as much productivity as they could from their environment. 1.3 Farming in early North America. What kinds of agricultural societies developed in North America? Maize farming spread north from Mexico into the area now part of the United States in the first millennium BCE. Over time, maize was adapted to a range of climates and its cultivation spread to all the temperate regions. 1.3.1 Farmers of the Southwest. Farming communities began to emerge in the arid Southwest during the first millennium BCE. Among the first to develop a settled farming way of life was a culture known to archaeologists as Mogollon. These people farmed maize, beans, squash, and constructed ingenious food storage pits in permanent village sites along what is today the southern Arizona, New Mexico border. Those pits may have been the precursors of what southwestern peoples today call kivas, sites of community religious rituals. During the same centuries, a culture known as Hohokam flourished in the region along the floodplain of the Salt and Gila rivers in southern Arizona. The Hohokam, who lived in farming villages, built and maintained the first irrigation system in America north of Mexico, channeling river water through 500 miles of canals to water desert fields of maize, beans, squash, tobacco, and cotton. Hohokam culture shared many traits with Mesoamerican civilization to the south, including platform mounds for religious ceremonies and large courts for ball playing. 1.3.2 The Anasazis. The best-known ancient farming culture of the Southwest is the Anasazi, which developed around the 1st century CE in the Four Corners area, where the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado meet on the Great Plateau of the Colorado River. Around 750 CE, possibly in response to population pressure and an increasingly dry climate, the residents of communities there began shifting from pit house villages to densely populated, multi-storied apartment complexes that the Spanish invaders called pueblos. Anasazi culture extended over a very large area. The sites of more than 25,000 Anasazi communities are known in New Mexico alone. The most prominent center was Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon. Completed in the 12th century, this complex of 700 interconnected rooms is a monument to the Anasazi Golden Age. The Anasazis faced a major challenge in the 13th and 14th centuries. The arid climate became even drier, and growing populations had to redouble their efforts to improve food production. A devastating drought from 1276 to 1293 resulted in repeated crop failures and eventual famine. The ecological crisis was heightened by the arrival in the 14th century of Athapascan migrants, ancestors of the Navajos and the Apaches. Athapascans raided Anasazi farming communities, taking food, goods, and possibly slaves. Gradually, Anasazi communities abandoned the Four Corners area altogether, most resettling along the Rio Grande, joining with local residents to form the Pueblo communities that were living there when the Spanish arrived. 1.3.3 Farmers of the Eastern Woodlands. Archaeologists date the beginning of the farming culture of eastern North America, known as woodland culture, from the first appearances of pottery in the region about 3,000 years ago. Woodland culture was based on a sophisticated way of life that combined gathering and hunting with the cultivation of a few local crops. Woodland people began cultivating maize during the first millennium CE, but even before that they had begun to adopt an increasingly settled existence and a more complex social organization, evidenced by complex earthen constructions. Around 1000 BCE, at a place called Poverty Point in northeastern Louisiana, residents erected a remarkable series of concentric semicircular earthen mounds covering an area about a mile square. Mound building was also a characteristic activity of the peoples living in the Ohio Valley during this period. The people of a culture known as Adena lived in semi-permanent villages and constructed large burial mounds during the first millennium BCE. They were succeeded by a culture called Hopewell. Hopewell chiefs mobilized an elaborate trade network, acquiring obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, and shells from the Gulf Coast. Hopewell artisans converted these materials into goods that played an important role in trade and were used to adorn the dead in their impressive graves. 1.3.4 Mississippian society. The Hopewell culture collapsed in the 5th century CE, perhaps as a result of an ecological crisis brought on by shifting climate patterns. Over the next several centuries, however, a number of important technological innovations were introduced in the East. The bow and arrow, developed first on the Great Plains, appeared east of the Mississippi in about the 7th century, greatly increasing the efficiency of hunting. At about the same time, maize farming spread widely through the East. A shift from digging sticks to flint hoes also took place about this time, further increasing the productive potential of maize farming. On the basis of these innovations, a powerful new culture known as Mississippian arose in the 7th or 8th century CE. The peoples of Mississippian culture were master maize farmers living in permanent community sites along the floodplains of the Mississippi Valley. Cahokia was the largest and most spectacular, with its monumental temple mounds, its residential neighborhoods, and its surrounding farmlands. But there were dozens of other urban communities, each with thousands of residents. 1.3.5 The politics of warfare and violence. These centers, linked by the Mississippi River and its many tributaries, became the earliest city-states north of Mexico, hierarchical chiefdoms that extended political control over the farmers of the surrounding countryside. With continued population growth, these cities engaged in vigorous and probably violent competition for the limited space along the rivers. It may have been the need for more orderly ways of allocating territories that stimulated the evolution of political hierarchies. The tasks of preventing local conflict, storing large food surpluses, and redistributing foodstuffs from farmers to artisans and elites required a leadership class with the power to command. Mississippian culture reached its height between the 11th and 13th century CE, the same period in which the Anasazi culture constructed its desert cities. Both groups adapted to their own environment the technology that was spreading northward from Mexico. Both developed impressive artistic traditions, and their feats of engineering reflect the beginnings of science and technology. They were complex societies characterized by urbanism, social stratification, craft specialization, and regional trade. Organized violence was probably rare among hunting bands, which could seldom manage more than a small raid against an enemy. Certain hunting peoples, though, such as the southward-moving Athapascans, must have engaged in systematic raiding of settled farming communities. Warfare was also common among farming confederacies fighting to gain additional lands for cultivation. The archaeological remains of Cahokia reveal that during the 13th and 14th centuries the residents enclosed the central sections of their city with a heavy log stockade. There must have been a great deal of violent warfare with other nearby communities. Also during this period, numerous towns were formed throughout the river valleys of the Mississippi, each based on the domination of farming countrysides by metropolitan centers. Eventually conditions in the upper Mississippi Valley deteriorated so badly that Cahokia and many other sites were abandoned altogether, and as the cities collapsed, people relocated in smaller, decentralized communities. Among the peoples of the South, however, Mississippian patterns continued into the period of colonization. 1.4 Cultural regions of North America on the eve of colonization. What important differences were there between Indian societies in the Southwest, South, and Northeast on the eve of colonization? An appreciation of the ways human cultures adapted to geography and climate is fundamental to an understanding of American history, for just as regions shaped the development of Indian cultures in the centuries before the arrival of Europeans, so they continued to influence the character of American life in the centuries thereafter. In order to understand the impact of regions on Indian cultures, anthropologists divide North America into several distinct culture areas, within which groups shared a significant number of cultural traits: Arctic, Subarctic, Great Basin, Great Plains, California, Northwest, Plateau, Southwest, South, and Northeast. 1.4.1 The population of Indian America determining. The size of early human population is a tricky business, and estimates vary greatly, but there seems to be general agreement among historical demographers that the population of the North American continent numbered between 5 and 10 million at the time of the first European voyages of discovery. The population of the Western Hemisphere as a whole may have numbered 50 million or more, the same order of magnitude as Europe's population at the time. Population varied tremendously by cultural region. Although the cultural regions of the Arctic, Subarctic, Great Basin, and Great Plains made up more than half the physical space of the continent, they were inhabited by only a small fraction of the native population. Those regions were home to scattered bands who continued to practice the archaic economy. Hunting and gathering continued in California as well, although the population there grew large and dense because of the region's natural abundance. In the Pacific Northwest, abundant salmon fisheries supported large populations concentrated in permanent villages. The people of the plateau also made their living by fishing, although their communities were not as large or as concentrated. The largest populations of the continent were concentrated in the farming regions of the Southwest, South, and Northeast. These were the areas in which European explorers, conquerors, and colonists concentrated their first efforts, and they deserve more detailed examination. See map. 1.3, 1.4.2 The Southwest. The single overwhelming fact of life in the Southwest is aridity. Summer rains average only 10 to 20 inches annually, and on much of the dry desert cultivation is impossible. A number of rivers, however, flow out of the pine-covered mountain plateaus. Flowing south to the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of California, these narrow bands of green winding through parched browns and reds have made possible irrigation farming along their courses. On the eve of European colonization, Indian farmers in the Southwest had been cultivating their fields for nearly 3,000 years. In the floodplain of the Gila and Salt rivers lived the Pimas and Tohono-O'odhams, descendants of the ancient Hohokam culture, and along the Colorado River, even on the floor of the Grand Canyon, the Yuman peoples worked small irrigated fields. In their oasis communities, desert farmers cultivated corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, and cotton, which they traded throughout the Southwest. Often described as individualists, desert farmers lived in dispersed settlements that the Spanish called rancherias, their dwellings separated by as much as a mile that way. Say the Pimas, people avoid getting on each other's nerves. Rancherias were governed by councils of adult men whose decisions required unanimous consent, although a headman was chosen to manage the irrigation works. East of the Grand Canyon lived the Pueblo peoples, named by the Spanish for their unique dwellings of stacked, interconnected apartments. Although speaking several languages, the Pueblos had a great deal in common, most notably their commitment to communal village life. A strict communal code of behavior that regulated personal conduct was enforced by a maze of matrilineal clans and secret religious societies. Unique combinations of these clans and societies formed the governing systems of different Pueblo villages. The Pueblos inhabit the oldest continuously occupied towns in the United States. The village of Orabe, Arizona, dates from the 12th century, when the Hopis founded it in the isolated central mesas of the Colorado Plateau. Using dry farming methods and drought-resistant plants, the Hopis produced rich harvests of corn and squash amid shifting sand dunes. The Athapascans, more recent immigrants to the southwest, also lived in the arid deserts and mountains. They hunted and foraged, traded meat and medicinal herbs with farmers, and often raided and plundered these same villages and rancherias. One group of Athapascans, the Apaches, continued to maintain their nomadic ways. But another group, known as the Navajos, gradually adopted the farming and handicraft skills of their Pueblo neighbors. 1.4.3 The South enjoys a mild, moist climate with short winters and long summers, ideal for farming. In the 16th century, large populations of Indian peoples farmed this rich land, fishing or hunting local fauna to supplement their diets. They lived in communities ranging from villages of 20 or so dwellings to large towns of 1,000 or more inhabitants. Mississippian cultural patterns continued among many of the peoples of the South. Along the waterways, many farming towns were organized into chiefdoms. Because most of these groups were decimated by disease in the first years of colonization, they are poorly documented. Archaeologists have excavated sites on the east bank of the Mississippi, in what is now Arkansas, inhabited by the Caddo people. The evidence suggests that in the 15th century they lived in complex ranked communities, built monumental temple mounds, and counted a population of more than 200,000. There is historical evidence about the Natchez, who survived into the 18th century before being defeated and dispersed in a war with the French. They too lived on the Mississippi, on the opposite bank from the Caddos, where they farmed the rich floodplains. The Natchez were also a ranked society, with a small group of nobility ruling over the majority. Persistent territorial conflict with other confederacies elevated warriors to an honored status. Public torture and human sacrifice of enemies were common. The Natchez give us our best glimpse of what life would have been like in the community of Cahokia. These chiefdoms were rather unstable. Under the pressure of climate change, population growth, and warfare, many were weakened and others collapsed. As a result, thousands of people left behind the grand mounds and earthworks and migrated to the woodlands and hill country, where they took up hunting and foraging, returning to the tried and true methods of forest efficiency. They formed communities and banded together in confederacies, which were less centralized and more egalitarian than the Mississippian chiefdoms and would prove considerably more resilient to conquest. Among the most prominent of these new ethnic groups were a people in present-day Mississippi and Alabama who came to be known as the Choctaws. Another group in western Tennessee became known as the Chickasaws, and another people in Georgia later became known as the Creeks. On the mountain plateaus lived the Cherokees, the single largest confederacy, which included more than 60 towns. For these groups, farming was somewhat less important, hunting somewhat more so. There were no ruling classes or kings, and leaders included women as well as men. Councils of elderly men governed the confederacies but were joined by clan matrons for annual meetings at the Central Council House. 1.4.4 The Northeast. The colder sector of the eastern woodlands has a varied geography of coastal plains and mountain highlands, great rivers, lakes, and valleys. In the first millennium CE, farming became the main support of the Indian economy in those places where the growing season was long enough to bring a crop of corn to maturity. In such areas of the Northeast, along the coasts and in the river valleys, Indian populations were large and dense. The Iroquois of present-day Ontario and upstate New York have lived in the Northeast for at least 4,500 years and were among the first Northeastern peoples to adopt cultivation. Iroquois women produced crops sufficient to support up to 50 longhouses, each occupied by a large matrilineal extended family. Typically, these villages were surrounded by substantial wooden walls or palisades, clear evidence of conflict and warfare. Population growth and the resulting intensification of farming in Iroquois stimulated the development of chiefdoms there as it did elsewhere. By the 11th century, several centers of population had coalesced from east to west across upstate New York. These were the 5 Iroquois chiefdoms or nations: the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. Oral histories collected from Iroquois speakers during the 19th century remember this as an era of persistent violence, possibly the consequence of conflicts over territory. To control this violence, the Five Nations established a confederacy. According to Iroquois oral history, Chief Digonawida, speaking through the great orator Hiawatha, convinced the Five Nations to agree to prohibit warfare with each other, replacing revenge with payment and gift exchange. Iroquois legend refers to Digonawida blocking out the sun as a demonstration of his powers. The Iroquois called their confederacy Haudenosaunee, meaning people of the Longhouse. Each nation, they said, occupied a separate hearth but acknowledged a common mother. As in the Longhouse, women played important roles in the confederacy, choosing male leaders who would represent their lineages and chiefdom on the Iroquois Council. The Confederacy suppressed violence among its members but did not hesitate to encourage war against neighboring Iroquoian speakers, such as the Hurons or the Eries, who constructed defensive confederacies of their own at about the same time. The other major language group of the Northeast was Algonquian, whose speakers divided among at least 50 distinct cultures. The Algonquian peoples north of the Great Lakes and in northern New England were hunters and foragers, organized into bands with loose ethnic affiliations. Several of these peoples were the first to become involved in the fur trade with European newcomers. Among the Algonquians of the Atlantic coast from present-day Massachusetts south to Virginia, as well as among those in the Ohio Valley, farming led to the development of settlements as densely populated as those of the Iroquois. In contrast to the Iroquois, most Algonquian peoples were patrilineal. In general, they lived in less extensive dwellings and in smaller villages, often without palisade fortifications. Although Algonquian communities were relatively autonomous, they began to form confederacies during the 15th and 16th centuries. Chapter: When Worlds Collide 1492-1590. American communities. The English at Roanoke. It was late August 1590 when the English vessels sailed through Hatteras Inlet into Pamlico Sound, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. Governor John White was returning to the first English community established in America. He had left 3 years before, sailing home to appeal for additional support. He was extremely anxious about the fate of the colonists, including his daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. From the deck he saw no sign of life. Rowing ashore, he found the colonists' houses taken down, their possessions spoiled and scattered about. Looking around for some sign of hope, White noticed a word carved on a nearby tree trunk, Croton, the name of a friendly Indian village some 50 miles south. White had left instructions that in the event of trouble the colonists were to leave the sign of a cross, and not finding one he reassured himself that his people awaited him at Croton. He returned to his vessel, anxious to rescue them. The Roanoke settlement had been sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh, a wealthy English adventurer. In 1584 Raleigh sponsored a small group of adventurers who first landed on the island the Indians called Roanoke. The men found the coastal region densely populated by a very handsome and goodly people, and were entertained with all love and kindness by a local chief named Wingina. To Wingina, the English were potential allies in his struggle to extend authority over more villages, and he granted the men permission to plan a large English settlement. He even sent 2 of his leading men back to England to help prepare the enterprise. When the Englishmen returned in 1585 to establish the colony of Virginia, the 2 Indians offered Wingina conflicting reports. Manteo, from the village of Croton, argued that English technology made these men powerful allies. But Wanchese told of the disturbing inequalities he had seen among the English and warned his chief of the potential brutality of these men. He rightly suspected their intentions, for Raleigh's plans were based on the expectation of exploiting the Indians. After building a rough fort on the island, the English requested supplies from Wingina. But as fall turned to winter and the stores diminished, he grew weary of their persistent demands. He was also stunned by the new diseases the English brought. In the spring Wingina ran out of patience. Before the Indians could act, however, the Englishmen caught wind of the rising hostility and in a surprise attack in May 1586 they killed several leaders, including Wingina. Leaving his head on a stake, they fled back to England. John White and Thomas Harriot, who had spent their time exploring the physical and human world of the coast and recording their findings in notes and sketches, were appalled by the turn of events. Back in England, Harriet insisted that the attack came upon causes that on our part might easily enough have been borne, and argued for the possibility that the Indians, through discreet dealing, might yet come to honor, obey, fear and love us. White proposed a new plan for a colony of genuine settlers, families who would attempt to live in harmony with the natives. In 1587, with Raleigh's financial support, John White returned to Virginia as governor of a new colony of 117 men, women, and children. White found himself among Indians who had already been completely alienated, and within a month, one of the colonists had been shot full of arrows. White's counterattack only increased the Indians' resolve to expel the intruders. The colonists begged White to sail home in their only seaworthy vessel to ask Raleigh for additional support. He left reluctantly, arriving in England just as war began with Spain. After 3 long and anxious years, Governor White now found the settlement destroyed, and the colonists gone. He returned to his vessel, eager to leave for the village of Crotone. But within minutes a great storm blew up, and the captain told White they had to sail for deeper waters. White would never glimpse the shores of America again. The English settlers of Roanoke became the lost colony, their disappearance and ultimate fate one of the enduring mysteries of colonial history. Blinded by their desire for immediate rewards, the colonists wasted the opportunity presented by the natives' initial welcome. But the Roanoke story also says something about the importance of community in the first attempts at colonization. Bits of evidence suggest that the so-called lost colonists lived out the rest of their lives as residents of Indian villages. Virginia Dare and other English children may have been adopted by Indian families, grown up and taken Indian spouses, in the process creating the first mixed community of English and Indians in North America. European colonists came to the Americas for a variety of reasons, but high on their list of priorities were plunder and profit. The invasion of America often included terrible violence, as well as frequent possibilities for accommodation and cooperation between natives and newcomers. The invasion also introduced mortal epidemic diseases that devastated native communities. The encounter of communities at Roanoke was, in numerous ways, a template for New World colonization. 2.1 The expansion of Europe. How did social change in Europe contribute to European expansion overseas? Roanoke and other European colonial settlements of the 16th century came in the wake of Christopher Columbus's voyage of 1492. The connection with America established by Columbus had earth-shaking consequences. Within a generation, the exchanges of peoples, crops, animals, and germs had transformed the world. The key to understanding these remarkable events is the transformation of Europe during the several centuries preceding the voyage of Columbus. 2.1.1 Western Europe. Before Columbus, Western Europe was an agricultural society. Most Europeans lived in family households clustered in farming villages. Farming and raising livestock had been practiced in Europe for thousands of years, but during the late Middle Ages there were great advances in technology. Water mills, iron plows, improved devices for harnessing ox and horsepower, and systems of crop rotation greatly increased productivity. From the 11th to the 14th centuries, the quantity of land under cultivation in Western Europe more than doubled. During the same period, the population nearly tripled. Europe was a world of social contrasts, characterized by a social system historians call feudalism. The land was divided into hundreds of small territories, each ruled by a family of lords that held a monopoly of wealth and power. Feudal lords commanded labor service from peasants and tribute in the form of crops. They were the main beneficiaries of medieval economic expansion. The Catholic Church itself was one of the most powerful feudal landowners in Europe. It insisted on its dogmas and actively persecuted heretics, non-believers, and devotees of older pagan religions. For the great majority of Europeans, living conditions were harsh. Most rural people survived on bread and porridge, supplemented with seasonal vegetables and an occasional piece of meat or fish. Infectious diseases abounded, perhaps a third of all children died before their 5th birthday, and only half the population reached adulthood. Famines periodically ravaged the countryside. In the 14th century, for example, a series of crop failures resulted in widespread starvation and death. This episode prepared the way for the so-called Black Death, a widespread epidemic of bubonic plague that swept in from Asia and wiped out a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353. Strengthened by the technological developments of the Middle Ages, Europe's agricultural economy quickly recovered. By 1,500 the population had rebounded to its former high of 65 million. 2.1.2 The merchant class and the Renaissance. The economic growth of the late Middle Ages was accompanied by the expansion of commerce, especially the trade in basic goods such as minerals, salt, timber, fish, cereals, wool, and wine. Commercial expansion stimulated the growth of markets and towns. The heart of this dynamic European commercialism lay in the city-states of Italy. During the late Middle Ages, the cities of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa launched armed commercial fleets that seized control of Mediterranean trade. The merchants of these cities became the principal outfitters of the Crusades, a series of great military expeditions promoted by the Catholic Church to recover Palestine from the Muslims. With the conquest of Jerusalem at the end of the 11th century, the silk and spice trades of Asia were delivered into the hands of Italian merchants. Asian civilization also supplied a number of technical innovations that further propelled European economic growth. From China alone came the compass, gunpowder, and use of movable type in printing. Contact with Muslim civilization provided access to important ancient texts, long lost in Europe but preserved in the great libraries of Alexandria and Baghdad. The revived interest in classical antiquity triggered a period of intellectual and artistic flowering from the 14th to 16th centuries that later generations called the Renaissance. The revolution in communication made possible by the printing press, the beginning of regular postal service, and the growth of universities helped spread Renaissance ideas throughout the elite circles of Europe. The Renaissance celebrated human possibility. This human-centered perspective was part of what became known as humanism, in which life on earth took precedence over the afterlife of the soul. This outlook was a critical component of the inquisitive and acquisitive spirit that motivated the exploration of the Americas. 2.1.3 The new monarchies. The Renaissance began amid the ruins of the plague. Famine and disease led to violence, as groups battled for their share of a shrinking economy. A series of peasant rebellions culminated in the Great English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Warfare among the nobility weakened and greatly reduced the power of the landed classes, and the Catholic Church was seriously destabilized by an internal struggle between French and Italian factions. It was during this period of social and political chaos that the monarchs of Western Europe began to replace the lords as the new centers of power. They built their legitimacy by promising internal order as they unified their realms. See Map 2.1. They built royal bureaucracies and standing armies and navies. In many cases, the new monarchs found support among the increasingly wealthy merchants, who in return sought lucrative royal contracts and trading monopolies. This alliance between commerce and political power was another important development that prepared the way for European expansion. 2.1.4 The Portuguese voyages. Portugal became the first of the new Renaissance kingdoms to send out explorers on voyages to distant lands. Lisbon, the principal port on the sea route between the Mediterranean and northwestern Europe, was a bustling, cosmopolitan city with large enclaves of Italian merchants. By 1385 the local merchant community had grown powerful enough to place João I, their favorite, on the throne. João had ambitious plans to establish a Portuguese trading empire. A central figure in this development was the king's son, Prince Henry, known to later generations as the Navigator. Prince Henry established an academy of eminent geographers, instrument makers, shipbuilders, and seamen. Studying the seafaring traditions of Asia and the Muslim world, the learned men of Sagres Point incorporated them into the design of a new ship called the Caravel, faster and better handling than any ship previously known in Europe. They promoted the use of Arab instruments for astronomical calculation. With such innovations, Europeans became the masters of the world's seas, a supremacy that would continue until the 20th century. The Portuguese explored the Atlantic coast of northwestern Africa for direct access to the lucrative gold and slave trades of that continent. By the time of Prince Henry's death in 1460, they had colonized the Atlantic islands of the Azores and the Madeiras and founded bases along the West African Gold Coast. In 1488, Portuguese Captain Bartholomew Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, and 10 years later Vasco da Gama, with the aid of Arab pilots, reached India. The Portuguese eventually built strategic trading forts along the coasts of Africa, India, Indonesia, and China, the first and longest-lasting outposts of European world colonization, and gained control of much of the Asian spice trade. Most important for the history of the Americas, the Portuguese established the Atlantic slave trade. For a full discussion of slavery, see Chapter 4. 2.1.5 Columbus reaches the Americas in 1476. Christopher Columbus, a young Genoan sailor, joined his brother in Lisbon, where he became a seafaring merchant for Italian traders. He developed the simple idea of opening a new route to the Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, known at that time as the Western Sea. Such a venture would require royal backing, but when he approached the various monarchs of Europe with his idea, their advisors laughed at his geographic ignorance, pointing out that his calculation of the distance to Asia was much too short. They were right, Columbus was wrong. But it turned out to be an error of monumental good fortune. Columbus finally sold his plan to the monarchs of Castile and Aragon, Isabel and Ferdinand. These two had just completed the Reconquista, a centuries-long struggle between Catholics and Muslims that ended Muslim rule in Spain. The Catholic monarchs of Spain were eager for new lands to conquer, and observing the successful Portuguese push to the south along the west coast of Africa, they became interested in opening lucrative trade routes of their own to the Indies. Columbus called his undertaking the Enterprise of the Indies, which suggests his commercial hopes. But his mission was more than commercial. One of his prime goals was to occupy the islands he found, establishing title for Spain by the right of occupancy. Like the adventurers who later established the first English colony at Roanoke, Columbus's objectives were starkly imperial. Columbus's 3 vessels reached the Bahamas in October 1492. But Columbus believed he was in the Indies, somewhere near the Asian mainland. He explored the northern island coasts of Cuba and Hispaniola before heading home, fortuitously catching the westerly winds that blow from the American coast toward Europe north of the tropics. Perhaps Columbus's most important discovery was the clockwise circulation of the Atlantic winds and currents that would carry thousands of European ships back and forth to the Americas. Leading Columbus's triumphal procession to the royal court were 6 Taino Indians, taken by force from their homes, and dressed for the occasion in bright feathers with ornaments of gold. "Should your majesties command it," Columbus told the monarchs, "all the inhabitants could be made slaves. Moreover," he reported, "there are many spices and great mines of gold and of other metals." In fact, none of the eastern spices familiar to Europeans grew in the Caribbean, and there were only small quantities of alluvial gold in the riverbeds of the islands. Columbus reported that he had left a small force behind in a rough fort on the northern coast of Hispaniola to explore for gold. The enthusiastic monarchs financed a return convoy of 17 vessels and 1,500 men that sailed in late 1493 to begin the systematic colonization of the islands. Like the later English colonists at Roanoke, Columbus expected the Indians would provide the necessary labor. But returning to Hispaniola, Columbus found his fort in ruins and his men all killed by the Tainos. Columbus directed his men to attack and destroy the nearby Taino villages, enslaving the inhabitants and demanding tribute in gold. Columbus's voyages were a disaster for the Tainos. The combined effects of warfare, famine, and demoralization resulted in the collapse of their society. Numbering perhaps 300,000 in 1492, they were reduced to fewer than 30,000 within 15 years, and by the 1520s had been effectively eliminated as a people. Columbus made 2 additional voyages to the Caribbean, both characterized by the same obsessive searching for gold and violent raiding for slaves. He died in Spain in 1506, still convinced he had opened a new way to Asia. This belief persisted among many Europeans well into the 16th century. But others had already begun to see the discoveries from a different perspective. Amerigo Vespucci of Florence, who voyaged to the Caribbean in 1499, was the first to describe the discoveries as mundus novus, a new world. When European geographers finally named the new lands early in the 16th century, they honored Vespucci's insight by calling them America. 2.2 The Spanish in the Americas. How did the Spanish invasion transform the Americas? Long before the English attempted to plant their first colony at Roanoke, the Spanish had created a huge and wealthy empire in the Americas. The Spanish created a caste system, in which a small minority of settlers and their offspring controlled the lives and labor of millions of Indian and African workers. But it was also a society in which colonists, Indians, and Africans mixed to form a new people. 2.2.1 The invasion of America. The first stages of the Spanish invasion of America included frightful violence. Armies marched across the Caribbean islands, plundering villages, slaughtering men, and capturing women. Columbus and his successors established an institution known as the encomienda, in which Indians were compelled to labor in the service of Spanish lords. In practice, it amounted to little more than slavery. Faced with labor shortages, slavers raided the Bahamas and soon depopulated them of native people. The depletion of gold on Hispaniola led to the invasion of the islands of Puerto Rico and Jamaica in 1508, and then Cuba in 1511. Meanwhile, rumors of wealthy native societies to the west led to scores of probing expeditions. The Spanish invasion of Central America began in 1511, and 2 years later Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama to the Pacific Ocean. In 1517, Spaniards landed on the coast of Mexico, and within a year they made contact with the Aztec Empire. Hernán Cortés, a veteran of the conquest of Cuba, landed on the Mexican coast in 1519 with armed troops. Within 2 years he overthrew the Aztec Empire, a spectacular military accomplishment that has few parallels in the annals of conquest. Cortés skillfully exploited the resentment of the many peoples who lived under Aztec domination, forging Spanish-Indian alliances that became a model for the subsequent European colonization of the Americas. Here, as at Roanoke and dozens of other sites of European invasion, colonizers found Indians eager for allies to support them in their conflicts with other Indians. Even so, the Aztecs were militarily powerful. They succeeded in driving the Spaniards from Tenochtitlan, and then put up a bitter and prolonged defense when Cortés returned with tens of thousands of Indian allies to besiege the capital. In the meantime, however, the Aztecs suffered a devastating epidemic of smallpox that killed thousands and undermined their ability to resist. In the aftermath of conquest, the Spanish plundered Aztec society, providing the Catholic monarchs with wealth beyond their wildest imagining. 2.2.2 The destruction of the Indies. The Indian peoples of the Americas resisted Spanish conquest with determination, but most proved a poor match for mounted warriors with steel swords. The Carib people successfully defended the outermost islands until the end of the 16th century, and the nomadic tribes of arid northern Mexico, known collectively as the Chichimecs, proved equally difficult to subdue. Some Europeans protested the horrors of the conquest. In 1511 the Catholic priest Antonio de Montesinos condemned the violence in a sermon delivered to colonists on Hispaniola. In the congregation was Bartolomé de las Casas, a man who had participated in the plunder of Cuba. Renouncing his own wealth, Las Casas entered the priesthood and dedicated his life to the protection of the Indians. Long before the world recognized the concept of universal human rights, Las Casas was proclaiming that the entire human race is one. In his brilliant history of the conquest, the destruction of the Indies, Las Casas blamed the Spanish for cruelties resulting in millions of Indian deaths. In effect, he accused them of genocide. Although later scholars disputed Las Casas's estimates of huge population losses, recent demographic studies suggest he was more right than wrong. The destruction of the Taínos on Hispaniola was repeated elsewhere. 2.2.3 The virgin soil epidemics. Las Casas was incorrect, however, in attributing most of these Indian deaths to warfare. Although lethal violence cost thousands of lives, and thousands more starved because their economies were destroyed, the primary cause of the drastic reduction in native populations was epidemic disease, influenza, plague, smallpox, measles, and typhus. Indian peoples lacked the antibodies necessary to protect them from European germs and viruses. Such devastating outbreaks of disease, striking for the first time against a completely unprotected population, are known as virgin soil epidemics. Smallpox made its first appearance in America in 1518. The epidemic hit Mexico in 1520, destroying the Aztecs and preparing the way for their conquest, then spreading along the Indian trade network. In 1524 it strategically weakened the Inca civilization of the Andes 8 years before their empire was conquered by Francisco Pizarro. Spanish chroniclers wrote that this single epidemic killed half the Native Americans it touched. Disease was the secret weapon of the Spanish, and it helps explain their extraordinary success. Warfare, famine, lower birth rates, and epidemic disease knocked the native population of the Americas into a downward spiral that was not reversed until the 20th century. By that time native population had fallen by more than 90%. It was the greatest demographic disaster in world history. The most notable difference between the European colonial experience in the Americas compared to Africa or Asia was this radical reduction in the native population. 2.2.4 The Columbian Exchange. The passage of diseases between the Old and New Worlds was one part of the large-scale exchange of people, animals, plants, and goods, what the historian Alfred Crosby terms the Columbian Exchange, that marks the beginning of the modern era of world history. The most obvious exchange was the vast influx into Europe of the precious metals plundered from the Aztec and Incan empires of the New World. Silver from mines the Spanish discovered and operated with Indian labor in Mexico and Peru tripled the amount of silver coin circulating in Europe between 1500 and 1550, and then tripled it again before 1600. The result of so much new coin in circulation was runaway inflation, which stimulated commerce and raised profits but lowered the standard of living for most people. Of even greater long-term importance were the New World crops brought to Europe. Maize, the staff of life for most native North Americans, became a staple crop in Mediterranean countries, the dominant feed for livestock elsewhere in Europe, and the primary provision for the slave ships of Africa. Potatoes provided the margin between famine and subsistence for the peasant peoples of northern Europe and Ireland. Although the Spanish failed to locate valuable spices such as black pepper or cloves in the New World, new tropical crops more than compensated. Tobacco, first introduced to Europe about 1550 as a cure for disease, was soon in wide use as a stimulant. American vanilla and chocolate both became highly valued. American cotton proved far superior to Asian varieties for the production of cheap textiles. Each of these native plants, along with tropical transplants from the Old World to America, with sugar, rice, and coffee being the most important, supplied the basis for important new industries and markets that altered the course of world history. Columbus introduced domesticated animals into Hispaniola and Cuba, and livestock were later transported to Mexico. The movement of Spanish settlement northward through Mexico was greatly aided by an advancing wave of livestock, for grazing animals did serious damage to native fields and forests. In the 17th century, horses reached the Great Plains of North America, where they eventually transformed the lives of the nomadic hunting Indians. 2.2.5 The Spanish in North America. Ponce de Leon, governor of Puerto Rico, was the first Spanish conquistador to attempt to extend the Spanish conquest to North America. In search of slaves, he made his first landing on the mainland coast, which he named Florida, in 1513. Warriors from the powerful Indian chiefdoms there beat back this and several other attempts at invasion, and in 1521 succeeded in killing de Leon. 7 years later, another Spanish attempt to colonize Florida, under the command of Panfilo de Narvaez, also ended in disaster. Most of Narvaez's men were lost in a shipwreck, but a small group of them survived, living and wandering for several years among the native peoples of the Gulf Coast. One of these castaways, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, published an account of his adventures in which he repeated rumors of a North American empire known as Cibola, with golden cities larger than the city of Mexico. Cabeza de Vaca's report inspired 2 great Spanish expeditions into North America. The first was mounted in Cuba by Hernán de Soto, a veteran of the conquest of Peru. Landing in Florida in 1539 with more than 700 men, de Soto pushed hundreds of miles through the heavily populated South, commandeering food and slaves from the Mississippian towns in his path. But de Soto failed to locate another Aztec empire. Moving westward, his expedition was twice mauled by powerful native armies and reduced by half. When he reached the Mississippi, he was met by a great flotilla of 200 vessels said to have come downriver from a great city to the west. The Spaniards crossed the river and pushed westward through present-day Arkansas, but failing to find the great city, returned to the Mississippi. There de Soto fell sick and died. Some 300 dispirited survivors eventually made it back to Mexico on rafts. The native peoples of the South had successfully turned back Spanish invasion. But de Soto had introduced epidemic disease, which over the next several years drastically depopulated and undermined the Mississippian chiefdoms of the South. In the same year of 1539, Spanish officials in Mexico launched a second attempt to conquer North America, this one aimed at the Southwest. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led 300 mounted men and infantry and 800 Indian porters north along well-marked Indian trading paths, passing through the settlements of Piman Indians near the present border of the United States and Mexico and finally reaching the Pueblo villages along the Rio Grande. The initial resistance of the Pueblo people was quickly quashed. But Coronado was deeply disappointed by their towns built of stone and mud, rudely fashioned. He sent out expeditions in all directions in search of the legendary golden cities of Cibola. He led his army as far north as the Great Plains, but returned without gold. For the next 50 years Spain would lose all interest in the Southwest. 2.2.6 The Spanish New World Empire century after Columbus. Some 250,000 European immigrants, most of them Spaniards, had settled in the Americas. Another 125,000 Africans had been forcibly resettled as slaves on the Spanish plantations of the Caribbean, as well as on the Portuguese plantations of Brazil. Most of the Spanish settlers lived in the more than 200 urban communities founded during the conquest. Spanish women came to America as early as Columbus's second expedition, but over the course of the 16th century they made up only about 10% of the immigrants. Most male colonists married or cohabited with Indian or African women, and the result was what some historians call a frontier of inclusion, a frontier society characterized by a great deal of mixing between male colonists and native or African women, with the corresponding growth of large mixed ancestry groups that the Spanish labeled mestizos and mulattoes. Indians died by the thousands in the conquest, but Indian genes were passed on in mixed ancestry people who quickly became the majority population in the mainland Spanish-American Empire. Populated by Indians, Africans, Spanish colonists, and their hybrid descendants, the New World colonies of Spain made up one of the largest and most powerful empires in world history. In theory, the empire operated as a highly centralized and bureaucratic system. But the Council of the Indies, the advisors of the Spanish king who made all the laws and regulations for the empire, was located far away in Spain. What looked in the abstract like a centrally administered empire was in fact a fragmented collection of colonial regions that tolerated a great deal of local decision-making. 2.3 Northern explorations and encounters. What important differences were there between Spanish, English, and French patterns of colonization? When the Spanish Empire was at the height of its power in the 16th century, the merchants and monarchs of other European seafaring states began looking across the Atlantic for opportunities of their own. See Map 2. 4. France was first to sponsor expeditions to the New World in the early 16th century. The French first attempted to plant settlements on the coasts of Brazil and Florida, but Spanish opposition forced them to concentrate on the North Atlantic. England did not develop its own plans to colonize North America until the second half of the 16th century. 2.3.1 Trade, not conquest, fish and furs. Long before France and England made attempts to found colonies, however, European fishermen were exploiting the coastal North American waters of the North Atlantic. By 1500, hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors were sailing annually to the Grand Banks, fishing for cod. The first European voyages of exploration in the North Atlantic used the talents of these experienced European sailors and fishermen. With a crew from Bristol, England, Genoese explorer Giovanni Caboto reached Labrador in 1497, but the English did little to follow up on his voyage. In 1524, Tuscan captain Giovanni de Verrazzano, sailing for the French, explored the North American coast from Cape Fear to the Penobscot River. Encouraged by his report, the French crown commissioned experienced Captain Jacques Cartier to locate a northwest passage to the Indies. In a series of voyages undertaken in 1534, 1535, and 1541, Cartier failed to locate such a passage but became the first European to explore the St. Lawrence River, which led to the Great Lakes and provided easy access to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Although Cartier failed in his attempt to plant French settlements on the St. Lawrence, his exploration established France's imperial claim to the lands of Canada and provided the French with an incomparable geographic advantage over other colonial powers. The French and other northern Europeans thus discovered the Indian people of the northern woodlands, and the Indians in turn discovered them. Contacts here were quite different from those of the tropics, and were based on commerce rather than conquest. The natives immediately appreciated the usefulness of textiles, glass, copper, and ironware. For his part, Cartier was interested in the fur coats of the Indians. Europeans, like Indians, used furs for winter clothing, but the growing population of the late Middle Ages had so depleted European wild game that the price of furs had risen beyond the reach of most people. Thus, the North American fur trade filled an important demand and produced high profits. The fur trade would continue to play an important role in the Atlantic economy for the next 3 centuries. The trade also had familiar negative consequences. European epidemic disease soon followed in the wake of the traders, and violent warfare broke out between tribes over access to hunting grounds. Moreover, as European manufactured goods, such as metal knives, kettles, and firearms, became essential to their way of life, Indians grew dependent upon European suppliers. By the end of the 16th century, more than 1,000 European ships were trading for furs each year along the northern Atlantic coast. Within a few years the French would attempt to monopolize the northern trade by planting colonies along the coast and on the St. Lawrence. The first French colonies in North America, however, were planted farther south by a group of French Protestant religious dissenters known as the Huguenots. 2.3.2 The Protestant Reformation and the first French colonies. The Protestant Reformation, the religious revolt against the Roman Catholic Church, began in 1517 when German priest Martin Luther publicized his differences with Rome. Luther declared that eternal salvation was a gift from God and not related to works or service to the Catholic Church. His protests fit into a climate of widespread dissatisfaction with the power and prosperity of the Catholic Church. Luther soon was attracting followers all over northwestern Europe, and just as soon, Catholic authorities were working to quash his nascent movement. One of Luther's most prominent converts was Jean Chauvin, a young theology student in Paris. In 1533, as the persecution of Protestants intensified, Calvin fled France, eventually taking up residence in Geneva, Switzerland, where civic leaders had renounced the Catholic Church and expelled the city's bishop. Working with those leaders, Calvin established a Protestant theocracy in Geneva. His followers in France, known as Huguenots, largely came from the urban middle class but also included a portion of the nobility, those opposed to the central authority of the Catholic monarch. In 1560 the French crown successfully defeated a plot among powerful Huguenots to seize royal power, inaugurating nearly 40 years of violent religious conflict in France. The first French colonies developed as attempts to establish a religious refuge in the New World for Huguenots. In 1562 French naval officer Jean Ribault and a group of 150 Huguenots from Normandy landed on Paris Island, near present-day Beaufort, South Carolina, and began construction of a fort and crude mud huts. Ribault soon returned to France for supplies, where he was caught up in the religious wars. The colonists nearly starved and were forced to resort to cannibalism before being rescued by a passing English ship. In 1564, Ribault and his followers established a second Huguenot colony, Fort Caroline, on the St. Johns River of Florida, south of present-day Jacksonville. In 1565 King Philip II of Spain sent Don Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, Captain General of the Indies, to crush the Huguenots. After founding a settlement south of Fort Caroline at a place called St. Augustine, he marched his men overland through the swamps, surprising the Huguenots from the rear. "I put Jean Ribault and all the rest of them to the knife," Menendez wrote triumphantly to the king. To prevent further French incursions, the Spanish built massive Castillo San Marcos and established a garrison at St. Augustine, which has the distinction of being the oldest continuously occupied European city in North America. 2.3.3 Social change in 16th century England. The English movement across the Atlantic, like the French, was tied to social change at home. Perhaps most important were changes in the economy. As prices for goods rose steeply, the result of New World inflation, English landlords, their rents fixed by custom, sought ways to increase their incomes. Seeking profits in the woolen trade, many converted the common pasturage used by tenants into grazing land for sheep, dislocating large numbers of farmers. Between 1500 and 1650 a third of all the common lands in England were enclosed in this way. Deprived of their livelihoods, thousands of families left their traditional rural homes and sought employment in English cities. The roads were crowded with homeless people. 16th century England also became deeply involved in the Protestant Reformation. There was great public resentment in England over the vast properties owned by the Church and the loss of revenue to Rome. When the Pope refused to grant Henry an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain, the king exploited this popular mood. Taking up the cause of reform in 1534, he declared himself head of a separate Church of England. Henry was succeeded by his young and sickly son Edward VI, who soon died. Next in succession was Edward's Catholic half-sister Mary, who persecuted and martyred hundreds of English Protestants and married Philip II of Spain, self-declared defender of the Catholic faith. With Mary's premature death, however, her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth I reversed course, tolerating a variety of perspectives within the English Church. Spain's monarch, Mary's widower, head of the most powerful empire in the world, vowed to overthrow Elizabeth. Fearing Spanish subversion on the neighboring Catholic island of Ireland, Elizabeth urged enterprising supporters such as Walter Raleigh and his half-brother Humphrey Gilbert to subdue the Irish Catholics and settle homeless English families on their land. During the 1560s, Raleigh, Humphrey, and many other commanders invaded the island and viciously attacked the Irish, forcing them to retreat beyond a frontier line of English settlement along the coast. The English considered the Irish an inferior race, and the notion that civilized people could not mix with such savages was an assumption English colonists would carry with them to the Americas. 2.3.4 Early English efforts in the Americas. England first. Ventures in the New World were made against the backdrop of its conflict with Spain. In 1562, John Hawkins violated Spanish regulations by transporting a load of African slaves to the Caribbean, bringing back valuable tropical goods. The Spanish attacked Hawkins on another of his voyages in 1567, an event English privateers such as Francis Drake used as an excuse for launching a series of devastating and lucrative raids against Spanish New World ports and fleets. A consensus soon developed among Elizabeth's closest advisors that the time had come to enter the competition for American colonies. Elizabeth authorized several private attempts at exploration and colonization. In the late 1570s, Martin Frobisher conducted 3 voyages of exploration in the North Atlantic. Next, Gilbert and Raleigh, fresh from the Irish Wars, planned the first true colonizing ventures. In 1583, Gilbert sailed with a flotilla of ships from Plymouth and landed at St. John's Bay, Newfoundland. He encountered fishermen from several other nations but nevertheless claimed the territory for his queen. His ship was lost, however, on the return voyage. Following his brother's death, Raleigh moved to establish a colony to the south, in the more hospitable climate of the mid-Atlantic coast. The Roanoke enterprise of 1587 seemed far more promising than Gilbert's, but it too failed. In contrast to the French, who concentrated on commerce, the English attempted to dominate and conquer the natives, drawing on their Irish experience. The most positive legacy of the Roanoke experience was the work of Thomas Harriot and John White, who mapped the area, surveyed its commercial potential, and observed the Indian inhabitants. Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, illustrated with impressive engravings of White's original watercolors, provided the single most accurate description of North American Indians at the moment of their contact with Europeans. Philip II was outraged at the English incursions into territory reserved by the Pope for Catholics. He had authorized the destruction of the French colony in Florida, and now he committed himself to smashing England. In 1588, he sent a fleet of 130 ships carrying 30,000 men to invade the British Isles. Countered by captains such as Drake and Hawkins, who commanded smaller and more maneuverable ships, and frustrated by an ill-timed storm that the English chose to interpret as an act of divine intervention, the Spanish Armada foundered. The Spanish monopoly of the New World had been broken in the English Channel. Conclusion. The era of European colonization in the Americas opened with Columbus's voyage in 1492. The subsequent Spanish invasion of America had catastrophic consequences for the Indian peoples of the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, and beyond. Wars of conquest and dispossession, and especially the introduction of epidemic disease, took an enormous toll in human life. Civilizations collapsed and whole cultures disappeared. Amidst this destruction, the Spanish succeeded in constructing the world's most powerful empire through the use of forced labor. Enormous wealth flowed across the Atlantic to Spain. Inspired by the Spanish success, the French and the English sought to plant colonies on the coast of North America in the second half of the century, but neither succeeded in establishing lasting communities. Meanwhile, a very different kind of colonial encounter, one based on commerce rather than conquest, was taking place along the coasts of northeastern North America. Early in the next century, the French would turn this development to their advantage. The English would move in a different direction. The colony of Roanoke in the land the English called Virginia failed because of the imperial assumptions and the brutal behavior of the first colonists toward the native residents. The experience might have suggested the importance and necessity of discreet dealing with native peoples. But instead the English would put their Irish experience to use, pioneering an altogether new kind of American colonialism. Chapter: Planting Colonies in North America. 1588, 1701. American communities and diversity in 17th century Santa Fe. It was a hot August day in 1680 when the frantic messengers rode into the small mission outpost of El Paso with the news that the Pueblo Indians to the north had risen in revolt. The corpses of more than 400 Spanish colonists lay bleeding in the dust. 2,000 survivors huddled inside the Palace of Governors in Santa Fe, surrounded by 3,000 angry warriors. Spanish colonists had been in New Mexico for a century. Franciscan priests from Mexico came first, in the 1580s, followed by a military expedition in search of precious metals. The Pueblos at first resisted, but in the face of Spanish armed might, they were forced to give in. Colonization took a tremendous toll on them. Epidemic disease, striking in successive waves, claimed thousands of lives. Taxes, tribute, and labor service left Pueblo storehouses empty, and starving times came much more frequently. Nomadic Apache neighbors, mounted on stolen Spanish horses, raided their villages with increasing frequency. From 1610 to 1680, the number of Pueblo communities fell by more than half, from 81 to 31, and their population plummeted by two-thirds to fewer than 20,000 people. Over the decades, thousands of Pueblos had accepted Christianity, but in the face of disaster there was a revival of their traditional religious rituals. Outraged Franciscan missionaries invaded the underground kivas, destroyed sacred Indian artifacts, and publicly humiliated holy men. In 1675 the Spanish governor rounded up religious leaders from many villages, publicly executed 3 of them, and whipped the others. One of those men, Pope of San Juan Pueblo, vowed to overthrow the regime. During the next several years he and other rebel leaders organized a conspiracy among more than 20 Pueblo communities. Santa Fe became the capital of a Pueblo confederacy led by Pope. He forced Christian Indians to plunge into the rivers, to wash away the taint of baptism, and ordered the destruction of everything Spanish. Getting rid of Jesus was one thing, but the rest was harder. Horses and sheep, fruit trees and wheat, new tools and new crafts, these things the Pueblos found useful. They also found that they missed the support of the Spanish in their struggle against the Apaches. With chaos mounting, Pope was deposed in 1690. In 1692, a Spanish force under Governor Diego de Vargas returned to New Mexico in an attempt to re-establish the colonial regime. Some communities welcomed him while others resisted. In 1696 there was another attempt at revolt, but Vargas crushed it with overwhelming force. The Spanish succeeded in their reconquest, but they seemed to have learned something in the process. They began to practice greater restraint, which enabled the Pueblos to accept their authority. New Mexico remained a colony under the authority of the Spanish. But in the aftermath of the Pueblo revolt, the governing principle was accommodation. Thus did the Spanish in New Mexico and elsewhere seek to include native peoples as subjects of the king and communicants of the church. Because the French developed a commercial empire, they too came to rely on a policy of native inclusion. In New England, Virginia, and Carolina, however, where English settlers developed agricultural colonies, the policy was one of exclusion. Indians were pushed to the periphery. These differences help explain the very different histories of the 3 principal colonial empires in North America. 3.1 The Spanish, the French, and the Dutch in North America. What were relations between Indians and Europeans? Like in New Spain, New France, and New Netherland. At the beginning of the 17th century the Spanish controlled the only colonial outposts on the North American mainland, a series of forts along the Florida coast to protect the Gulf Stream sea lanes used by the convoys carrying wealth from their New World colonies to Spain. During the first 2 decades of the new century, however, the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English were all drawn into planting far more substantial colonies in North America. Instead of sending colonists, both Spain and France relied on a policy of converting Indians into subjects, and as a result there was a great deal of cultural mixing between colonists and natives. New Spain and New France became frontiers of inclusion, where native peoples were incorporated into colonial society. The Dutch followed the French model when they established their colony on the Hudson River on the northeastern Atlantic coast. 3.1.1 New Mexico after the 1539 expedition of Francisco Vasquez de Coronado failed to turn up vast Indian empires to conquer in the northern Mexican deserts, Spanish interest in the southwest faded. The densely settled farming communities of the Pueblos did offer a harvest of converts for Christianity, however, and by the 1580s Franciscan missionaries were at work there. Soon rumors drifted back to Mexico City of rich mines along the Rio Grande, raising the hopes of finding another Aztec empire. In 1598, Juan de Onate, the son of a wealthy mining family of New Spain, financed an expedition made up of Indians and mestizos with the purpose of mining both gold and souls. Moving north into the upper Rio Grande Valley, Onate encountered varying degrees of resistance. He laid siege at Acoma, set high atop a great outcropping of desert rock. Indian warriors killed dozens of Spaniards with their arrows, and women and children bombarded them with stones. But in the end, the attackers succeeded in climbing the rock walls and laying waste to the town, killing 800 men, women, and children. All surviving warriors had one of their feet severed, and more than 500 people were enslaved. In 1606, Spanish authorities in Mexico recalled Oñate for his failure to locate the fabled gold mines. The Church, however, convinced the Spanish monarchy to subsidize New Mexico as a special missionary colony. In 1609, a new governor founded the capital of Santa Fe, and from this base the Franciscan missionaries penetrated all the surrounding Indian villages. The colonial economy of New Mexico was never very prosperous. Spanish expectations, never very high, were even lower after the Pueblo Revolt and the Reconquest. Very few newcomers came from Mexico. Population growth was almost entirely the result of marriages between colonial men and Indian women. By 1700, this northernmost outpost of the Spanish Empire in America contained some 3,000 mestizos in a few towns along the Rio Grande, surrounded by an estimated 50,000 pueblos in some 50 villages. New Mexico was a frontier of inclusion. 3.1.2 New France. In the early 17th century, the French devised a strategy to monopolize the northern fur trade. In 1605, Samuel de Champlain, acting as the agent of a royal monopoly, helped establish the outpost of Port Royal on the Bay of Fundy in what became known as the colony of Acadia. It proved impossible, however, to control the coastal trade from that location. In 1608, he founded the settlement of Quebec on the St. Lawrence River at a site where he could intercept the traffic in furs. He forged an alliance with the Huron Indians, who controlled access to the rich fur grounds of the Great Lakes, and in 1609 and 1610 joined them in making war on their traditional enemies, the five-nation Iroquois Confederacy. Champlain sent agents and traders to live among native peoples, where they learned native languages and customs, and directed the flow of furs to Quebec. Thousands of Frenchmen went to New France as engagers in the fur trade or the fishery, but 9 out of 10 returned to France when the term of their service ended. The French might have populated their American empire with thousands of willing Huguenot religious dissenters, but the state resolved that New France would be exclusively Catholic. As a result, the population grew very slowly, reaching a total of only 15,000 colonists by 1700. Rather than facing the Atlantic, the communities of Canada tended to look westward toward the continental interior. It was typical for the sons of habitants to take to the woods, working as independent traders or coureurs de bois, paid agents of the fur companies. Most eventually returned to their home communities, but others married Indian women and raised mixed ancestry families in distant Indian villages. French traders were living on the Great Lakes as early as the 1620s, and both missionaries and traders were exploring the upper Mississippi River by the 1670s. In 1681, 1682, fur trade commandant Robert Sieur de La Salle navigated the mighty river to its mouth on the Gulf of Mexico and claimed its entire watershed for France. Thus, the French, like the Spanish, established a frontier of inclusion in North America. But in other ways the two colonial systems were quite different. The Spanish program was the conquest of native peoples and their exploitation as a labor force in mining, farming, or livestock raising. The French, on the other hand, lacking sufficient manpower to bully, dispossess, or enslave native peoples, sought to build an empire through alliance and commerce with independent Indian nations. There were also important differences between Spanish and French missionary efforts. Unlike Franciscans in 17th century Santa Fe, who insisted that natives must accept European cultural norms as part of their conversion, Jesuit missionaries in New France learned native languages and attempted to understand native customs, in an effort to introduce Christianity as a part of the existing Indian way of life. 3.1.3 New Netherland. The United Provinces of the Netherlands, commonly known as Holland, was only a fraction of the size of France, but in the 16th century it became the center of Europe's economic transformation. Amsterdam became the site of the world's first stock exchange and investment banks. Dutch investors built the largest commercial fleet in Europe. Early in the 17th century the United Netherlands organized two great monopolies, the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, combining naval military might and commercial strength in campaigns to seize the maritime trade of Asia and the Atlantic. Backed by powerful armed vessels known as men of war, Dutch traders constructed a series of trading posts in China, Indonesia, India, Africa, Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, making Holland into the world's greatest commercial power. The Dutch first established themselves in North America with the explorations of Henry Hudson in 1609, and within a few years had founded settlements on the Hudson River called Fort Orange, and at New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. In the 1640s the Dutch also succeeded in overwhelming a small colony of Swedes planted by a Swedish company on the lower Delaware River in 1637, incorporating that region as well into their sphere of influence. Seeking to match French success in the fur trade, the Dutch West India Company negotiated a commercial alliance with the five-nation Iroquois Confederacy. They soon launched a campaign to make themselves into the strategic middlemen of the fur trade. Beginning in the 1640s, the Iroquois conducted a series of military 3.2 the Chesapeake, Virginia and Maryland. How did tobacco cultivation shape English colonization in the Chesapeake? England first attempted to plant colonies in North America during the 1580s in Newfoundland and at Roanoke Island in present-day North Carolina. Both attempts were dramatic failures. England's war with Spain suspended further efforts. But thereafter the English once again turned to the Americas. 3.2.1 Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy in 1607 group of London investors known as the Virginia Company sent a small convoy of vessels to Chesapeake Bay, where 100 men built a fort they named Jamestown in honor of King James I. It was destined to become the first permanent English settlement in North America. The Chesapeake was already home to an estimated 14,000 Indian inhabitants. The village communities of the Chesapeake were united in a politically sophisticated union known as the Powhatan Confederacy, led by a powerful chief named Wahunsenaccook, whom the Jamestown colonists called King Powhatan. Powhatan's feelings about Europeans were mixed. He knew they could mean trouble. Still, Powhatan was eager to forge an alliance with these people from across the sea to obtain access to supplies of metal tools and weapons. As was the case elsewhere in the Americas, Indians attempted to use Europeans to pursue ends of their own. The Jamestown colonists had come to find gold and a passage to the Indies, and failing at both they spent their time gambling and drinking. They survived only because of Powhatan's help. But as more colonists arrived from England and demands for food multiplied, Powhatan had second thoughts. He now realized, he declared to Smith, that the English had come, not for trade, but to invade my people and possess my country. During the terrible winter of 1609-1610, more than 400 colonists starved and a number resorted to cannibalism. Of the 500 colonists at Jamestown in the fall, only 60 remained alive by the spring. Determined to prevail, the Virginia Company sent out a large additional force of men, women, and livestock, committing itself to a protracted war against native men, women, and children. The grim fighting persisted until 1613, when the English captured one of Powhatan's favorite daughters, Matoka, a girl of about 15 whom the colonists knew by her nickname, Pocahontas. Eager for the return of his child, and worn down by violence and disease, the next year Powhatan accepted a treaty of peace. The peace was sealed by the marriage of Pocahontas, who converted to Christianity, to John Rolfe, one of the leading colonists. For a brief moment it seemed the English too might move in the direction of a society of inclusion. In 1617 Rolfe traveled with his wife and son to England. But Pocahontas fell ill and died there. Crushed by the news, Powhatan abdicated in favor of his brother Opeshankana before dying of despair. Economic and social developments, however, were already pushing Virginia in a dramatically different direction from New Spain and New France. 3.2.2 Tobacco, expansion, and warfare. The Virginia colonists struggled to find the merchantable commodity for which Thomas Harriot, the scientist who accompanied the Roanoke expedition, had searched. They finally found it in tobacco. Tobacco had been introduced to the English by Francis Drake in the 1580s, and by the 1610s a craze for smoking had created strong demand for the product. Pocahontas's husband John Rolfe developed a mild hybrid variety, and soon the first commercial shipments of cured Virginia leaf reached England. Tobacco provided the Virginia Company with the first returns on its investment. Questions of land and labor would dominate the history of colonial Virginia. Tobacco cultivation required a great deal of hand labor, and it quickly exhausted the soil. The Virginia Company instituted a program of headright grants, awards of large plantations to wealthy colonists who agreed to transport workers from England at their own cost. Because thousands of English families were being thrown off the land, many were attracted to Virginia. Thus, English colonization took a different turn from the Spanish, who mostly sent male colonists. Moreover, the English concentration on plantation agriculture contrasted with the French emphasis on trade. With little need to incorporate Indians into the colony as workers or marriage partners, the English pushed natives out. Virginia became a frontier of exclusion. The Powhatans finally sued for peace in 1632. In the meantime, however, the war had bankrupted the Virginia Company. In 1624, England converted Virginia into a royal colony with civil authorities appointed by the Crown, although property-owning colonists continued to elect representatives to the colony's House of Burgesses, created in 1619 in an attempt to encourage immigration. Although disease, famine, and warfare took a heavy toll, continuous emigration from England produced a doubling of the colonial population every 5 years, and by 1640 it numbered approximately 10,000. Now the English outnumbered the Powhatans, who were decimated by violence and disease. In 1644, Opechancanough organized a final desperate revolt in which more than 500 colonists were killed. But the next year the Virginians crushed the Powhatans, capturing and executing their leader. A formal treaty granted the Indians a number of small reserved territories. 3.2.3 Maryland in 1632, King Charles I reigned. 1625, 1649, granted 10 million acres at the northern end of Chesapeake Bay to the Calvert family, the Lords Baltimore, important Catholic supporters of the English monarchy. The Calverts named their colony Maryland, in honor of the king's wife, and in 1634 sent the first party of colonists to found the settlement of St. Mary's near the mouth of the Potomac River. Two features distinguished Maryland from Virginia. First, it was a proprietary colony in which the Calvert family held the sole power to appoint civil officers and was sole owner of all the land, which they planned to carve into feudal manors, providing them with rents. Second, the Calvert family encouraged settlement by Catholics, a persecuted minority in 17th-century England. In fact, Maryland became the only English colony in North America with a substantial Catholic minority. Yet Maryland quickly became much like neighboring Virginia. The tobacco plantation economy created pressures for labor and land that could not be met by the Calverts' original feudal plans. In 1640, the colony adopted the system of headright grants. Previously developed in Virginia, and settlements of independent planters quickly spread out on both sides of Chesapeake Bay. By the 1670s, Maryland's English population numbered more than 15,000.3.2.4 community life in the Chesapeake. At least 3/4 of the English migrants to the Chesapeake came as indentured servants. In exchange for the cost of their transportation to the New World, men and women contracted to labor for a master for a fixed term. Most were young, unskilled males, who served for 2 to 7 years, but some were skilled craftsmen, unmarried women, or even orphan children. African slaves were first introduced to the Chesapeake in 1619, but slaves were more expensive than servants, and as late as 1680 they made up less than 7% of the population. In the hard-driving economy of the Chesapeake, however, masters treated servants as cruelly as they treated slaves. Because of the high mortality resulting from epidemics of typhus and malaria, approximately 2 of every 5 servants died during the term of their indenture. Indentured labor may not have been slavery, but this may have seemed to the indentured servants like a distinction without a difference. Many indentured servants who survived their terms and were able to raise the price of passage quickly returned to England. Those who remained became eligible for freedom dues, clothing, tools, a gun, or a spinning wheel to help them get started on their own. They often headed west in the hope of cutting a farm from the forest. Because most emigrants were men, whether free or indentured, free unmarried women often married as soon as they arrived. Their scarcity provided women with certain advantages. Shrewd widows bargained for a remarriage agreement that gave them a larger share of the estate than what was set by common law. But because of high mortality rates, family size was smaller and kinship bonds, one of the most important components of community, were weaker than in England. English visitors often remarked on the crude conditions of community life. Prosperous planters, investing everything in tobacco production, lived in rough wooden dwellings. On the western edge of the settlements, freed servants lived with their families in shacks, huts, or even caves. Colonists spread across the countryside in search of new tobacco lands, creating dispersed settlements with hardly any towns. Before 1650 there were few community institutions such as schools and churches. Nevertheless, the Chesapeake was a growing region. By the end of the 17th century, the combined population of the Maryland and Virginia colonies was nearly 90,000. In contrast to the colonists of New France, who were developing a distinctive identity because of their connections with native peoples, the English residents of the Chesapeake maintained close emotional ties to the mother country. 3.3 The New England colonies. What were the social and political values of Puritanism, and how did religious dissent shape the history of the New England colonies? Both in climate and in geography, the northern coast of North America was far different from the Chesapeake. Merchantable commodities, such as tobacco, could not be produced there, and thus it was far less favored for investment and settlement. Instead, the region became a haven for Protestant dissenters from England, who gave the colonies of the North a distinctive character of their own. See Map 3.3. 3.3.1 Puritanism. Most English men and women continued to practice a Christianity little different from traditional Catholicism. But the English followers of John Calvin, known as Puritans because they wished to purify and reform the English Church from within, grew increasingly influential during the last years of Elizabeth's reign at the end of the 16th century. The Calvinist emphasis on enterprise meant that Puritanism appealed to merchants, entrepreneurs, and commercial farmers. They argued for reviving communities by placing Reformed Christian congregations at their core to monitor the behavior of individuals. James I abandoned Queen Elizabeth's policy of religious tolerance. His persecution of the Puritans, however, merely stiffened their resolve and turned them toward open political opposition. James's son and successor, Charles I, was heavily criticized by the increasingly vocal Puritan minority for marrying a French Roman Catholic princess and supporting high church policies, emphasizing the authority of the clerical hierarchy and traditional forms of worship. In 1629, determined to rule without these troublesome opponents, Charles dismissed Parliament and launched a campaign of repression against the Puritans. This political turmoil provided the context for the migration of thousands of English Protestants to New England. 3.3.2 Plymouth Colony. The first English colony in New England was founded by a group of religious dissenters known to later generations as the Pilgrims. One group moved to Holland in 1609, but fearful that tolerant and secular Dutch society was seducing their children, they decided on emigration to North America. Backed by the Virginia Company of London and led by tradesman William Bradford, 102 people sailed from England on the Mayflower in September 1620. The little group, mostly families but including a substantial number of single men hired by the investors, arrived in Massachusetts Bay at the site of the former Indian village of Pawtuxet, which the English renamed Plymouth. Soon the hired men began to grumble about being excluded from decision-making, and to reassure them Bradford drafted an agreement by which all the male members of the expedition did covenant and combine together into a civil body politic. The Mayflower Compact was the first document of self-government in North America. Weakened by scurvy and malnutrition, nearly half the colonists perished over the first winter. Like the earlier settlers of Roanoke and Jamestown, however, they were rescued by Indians. Massasoit, the sachem, or chief, of the Pecanicots, offered the newcomers food and advice in return for an alliance against his enemies, the Narragansetts. It was the familiar pattern of Indians attempting to incorporate European colonists into their own world. The Pilgrims supported themselves by farming, but like all colonies, Plymouth needed a source of revenue, in their case in order to pay off their English investors. The foundation of their commercial economy was the cod fishery in the rich coastal banks of the Atlantic. With this revenue, the Pilgrims were able to establish self-sufficient community. 3.3.3 The Massachusetts Bay Colony in England. The political climate of the late 1620s convinced growing numbers of influential Puritans that the only way to protect their congregations was by emigration. In 1629 a royal charter was granted to a group of wealthy Puritans who called their enterprise the Massachusetts Bay Company, and an advance force of 200 settlers left for the fishing settlement of Naumkeag on Massachusetts Bay, which they renamed Salem. The colonists hoped to establish what John Winthrop, their leader and first governor, called a city on a hill, a New England model of reform for Old England. In this they differed from the Pilgrims, who never considered returning. Between 1629 and 1643, some 20,000 individuals relocated to Massachusetts, establishing the port town of Boston and ringing it with towns. In 1629, Puritan leaders transferred company operations from England to Massachusetts, and within a few years had transformed the company into a civil government. The original charter established a general court composed of a governor and his deputy, a board of magistrates, and the members of the corporation, known as freemen. In 1632, Governor Winthrop and his advisors declared that all the male heads of households in Massachusetts, who were also church members, were freemen. 2 years later, the freemen secured their right to select delegates to represent